Okay, I'm going to show you a technique that I use when I need to piece odd shapes together, and it's using freezer paper. This is different from other methods of freezer paper piecing, and you can look those up on YouTube. I'll include some links in my post to some other tutorials by other makers. But this is a method, honestly, I came up with it early on when I started quilting, and I started making all these quilts with a whole bunch of triangles, and I didn't know how to do the quilt math. So this is the technique I used. And it was kind of silly for that, for half square triangles, but when you're dealing with these odd shapes, I find that this works really well. So we've outlined our whole template. There's no seam allowance included on any of these pieces. And I've made little registration marks. So I'll just hold this up a little bit. You can see I've put these little lines between each piece. You can see that through these little registration marks that we're going to use when we're sewing the pieces back together. So the first step is to cut out your pieces, but rather than cutting them all out at once and then mixing them all up and going, where am I? I'm just going to start cutting out one section at a time, and I'll cut out each piece separately right along the trace lines. I've got the first 3 pieces cut out from one of the sections. This is section 4. And you can see this is the dull side of the paper side of the freezer paper, and then this is the shiny side, and this is the side that you're going to iron down onto your fabric. So this one I already marked. I marked up which fabric goes where on my whole layout. This one I'm using some black stealth fabric, and here it is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to iron this right onto the right side of the fabric. I don't have to, I mean, I can roughly cut this out here and then take it over to my iron, but, and then this also allows you, like if there's a certain section that you want to highlight or you want to fussy cut, you can move your piece around and you can see through it just enough to see what's underneath. So I'm not too fussed about it, but I'll probably put it here. I'm just going to set an iron on it for a couple seconds to put it in place. And then I'm going to trim around the shape, but I'm going to include my 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. And that goes for all these pieces that you've cut. Okay, so I'll iron this down and then I'll show you how I trim. I've ironed my pieces onto the right sides of my fabric. So this is doing it the opposite way of the way we did it with the traditional paper piecing where you're working on the back side. This I do right on the front, and I'm taking my ruler and I'm cutting out around the shapes at 1/4 inch for my seam allowance. Okay. And I didn't show you when I was cutting out these paper pieces, I just used scissors, but you could also use a rotary blade. But I know that's cutting paper with a rotary, and that could be controversial in the quilting world. But if you are concerned about accuracy and getting those lines perfect, when you're cutting the paper itself, you could use a rotary blade. But I just use scissors. Okay, so this is what this piece looks like now. I've got the paper in the center, and then I've got this 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, and then I've got these little registration marks that I just drew on. I didn't use a ruler or anything, I just drew them on, and that'll help me line the pieces back up together when I'm sewing them together, okay? So I'll just trim this one up next, and then we will sew them together, and we'll be sewing them paper sides together. But I'll show you why I put those registration marks on. So as long as your machine is set to 1/4 inch accurately, when you sew these together, you won't be sewing through the paper. You'll be sewing right up against the paper. And you'll be sewing so that your little registration marks line up. So there's the first piece, and there's the next piece, and these have to go together. So I've got my pins, and I'm just going to zoom in so you can see this better. But what I want to do is put these right sides together, and then when you can just have a peek and make sure that your lines are lining up, right? So here's the little mark that I made on this side. It goes across to this one. You can even peel it up a little bit. That's lined up perfectly. Do you see what I mean? And then you've got the pieces lining back up again. Here's the other section. There's my little double line. There it is there. You fold it back. Yep, it works. And then we're just going to take this to the machine and sew it 1/4 inch right along here, okay? And then you won't be sewing through that paper, see? But the paper is butted up against one another and they're registered perfectly together. And you just continue the whole project like that, but I'll show you how that looks, okay? Now the two pieces are put together and you can see I've done my 1/4 inch stitch. The paper hasn't been stitched through, so that's what makes this a really fun method, because then you're just peeling the paper off and it does not affect, doesn't leave any residue or anything on the fabric itself. And then you just go ahead and you start adding the next piece. So I'll add this piece and then we'll do the 4 sections and put all the sections together. Now, what I did not do and I should have done, and I'm realizing it now, so I'm telling you, is that I put the little registration marks between these sections. I didn't draw any registration marks to get this put together properly with the other section. So when you are creating this, ideally there's no space. Ideally you draw the entire block all in one piece, right? And then you do your registration marks wherever fabric meets one another. And that's the best method for making sure everything comes together properly. But even without the registration marks between the sections, I'll be able to line the seams up together when I have to put them together. So I'll be able to do some seam nesting. Yeah. Oh, Libs. What day is it? Wednesday? I don't know what day it is. It's hot out. I don't know. But in any case, this is the way I do this. And what's cool about this method is that you could take any kind of irregular block or picture, or my very first watcher quilt, I projected it onto the wall, onto a big piece of freezer paper, and I traced all the shapes for the watcher, and then that's how I put it together, was by using this method. So it's really fun, it's easy, and I love that you're not stuck at the end pulling all that paper out. For those of you who did use the paper sew through method, now you're like, oh man. But you can try this method too if you've got the freezer paper, okay? So I'll put this one through, and I like to keep all the paper in place until the block is together, and then I'll peel them all off, because that way I can use the registration marks, make sure everything gets together, and then I peel them off when I'm all done sewing the whole block. All right, I'm going to sew the other sections together and then we'll have a look at the finished block. If you made that little whoops like I did, where I didn't put registration marks between the sections, because when I traced the sections out, I left space between them, you can just cut out your section, line it up. See, I'm lining it up. So this is section 1. I'm lining it up with section 2. I'm just going to hold it in place and then going to make my little marks just like that. Okay, 1, 2, all the way down. And then, ta-da, fixed. See, I don't know. I find, I can usually find a way to fix my problems, and there, I did it. Okay, so now I've got the registration marks. Now I can take this, cut this section up and work on this next. Whew, hooray for problem solving. We got this. I now have these 2 sections together, the 2 corners, and I have to complete these 2. But here's another cool thing about this method. In the original pattern and in the paper piecing version, you're making these long strips, right? And even if you were to do the fold back version of freezer paper, you'd still end up with these long pieces, and that can be a little overwhelming. So maybe you don't want to do it that way. I might actually piece these like this. I might work on these four, getting these four sections together, and then sewing these together and adding them on here. It allows you to kind of look at the overall construction and decide, wait, what's going to be the easiest way for me to construct this? So over here at my machine, I'm sewing the pieces together. I have my pins going in the direction that I sew through the seam allowance, and I pull them out as I go. Very important not to sew over those pins. And really, I know you can't see the paper, well, as you're sewing, because the paper's on the inside, but as long as you've got your machine set to a proper 1/4 of an inch, you won't be going through the paper when you sew. And I really recommend, if you don't have a 1/4 inch flanged foot for your machine, I don't know what I would do without it, honestly. It really helps keep everything in line for me. It's easier than trying to eyeball or follow these little lines on your machine at a 1/4 of an inch. So this flanged foot really helps when you're piecing these together. And that's it. You're just sewing your pieces together. I've got all of these prepped in advance in pairs, and so I can just sort of chain piece them and then open them back up and put them back together like a puzzle and see which step I need to do next. But that's it. So yeah, you can't see the paper because the paper is on the inside here. But that's okay. You shouldn't be going through it as long as you've got everything set up on your machine at a proper 1/4 of an inch and you've cut a proper 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way around the outside of your paper. Then as far as ironing goes, here's this whole center section of this block, right? So I may just, I've opened these up. I haven't ironed them yet. And to help, nest seams and get perfect alignment, I will iron in opposite directions. So on this one, I'm going to iron the seam towards this piece. On this next section, I'll iron it in the opposite direction. Same goes for this, back to the left, and this one back to the right. Look I got my one shoe off for my sewing. Always, I cannot sew with a shoe on. I don't know why, but I know I'm not the only quilter who does this. Anyway, so you just iron your seams in opposite directions whenever you can, and then that will help you nest seams as you're putting these pieces together. But also you can see I've got my little registration marks, so that will help when I'm putting these pieces together. All right, so I'm going to get this whole center section put together and then add those two sides, and then the block is done. Here's the block all pieced together. The papers are still on it, and you can see there are these big dog ears on the corners that you can trim off once you remove the papers or before you remove them, up to you. Probably best to use a ruler, or you can just take your scissors and clip them. Regardless, here it is. You don't have to deal with peeling papers out from seams. Hopefully, look at some of them are pretty close to the seams, but all you have to do is peel the paper off. Okay, I caught some of them in my machine. That's okay. They should just peel away like this. Okay, and you just peel them. And if you did catch them with thread, just be really careful as you pull that you're not pulling your stitches, okay? So this one's pretty tight. I could feel it as I was sewing it that it was tight. Ooh, cool, huh? Now, if you've done this and you want to use these again, you should be able to use these again. They should stick down a few more times with your iron because they still have that plastic on them. As you can see, I've used black fabric here and there's no residue left on the fabric from that freezer paper. So it's super fabric friendly, and look how easy it is. I've just got this block that's got all these pieces that are perfectly lined up. I will tell you that the one section that where I forgot to put my registration marks along this part, I had to stitch rip it and then reposition it. I pinned it and then kind of opened it up to check that everything was lined up. So these registration marks do make all the difference in helping to keep everything lined up. And there you have it. That's my funky FPP technique. It's different from the other ones where you're folding back the foundation paper, but it works for me. And oh my God. Oh gosh, there, ta-da, la la la. there you have it. That's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I've got lots of links to other resources and ways of doing foundation piecing. And then I'm going to follow this up with another post, public post with links to all kinds of designers who specialize in writing FPP patterns, because there's some really great ones out there. And once you get the hang of it, it's really fun, right? Of course.